Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to have all of you gathered here virtually. We may be in all parts of the world, but through the Lupus Research Alliance, we are together today and always. Hi, I'm Brenda Blackmon, and welcome to the Lupus and COVID-19, What You Need to Know About Lupus and to What You Need to Know live webcast. Many of you know why I am so devoted to the Lupus Research Alliance. It's because my daughter Kelly nearly died after getting diagnosed with lupus, and I believe that supporting research is the very best way that I can provide for her future. How different our lives are today. That's because just a few weeks ago, COVID-19 arrived. Oh my goodness, I've gotten so upset about this. There is much fear and confusion, especially in our lupus community. That's why the Lupus Research Alliance is hosting this live webcast to help clarify your questions and put things into perspective. And who could have imagined how that very medication that many people with lupus rely on, hydroxychloroquine, more commonly known in our community as Plaquenil, would be thrust into the spotlight as a potential threat and reduce symptoms of treatment and reduce symptoms of COVID-19, even though only small studies and anecdotal evidence exist. With us today is an esteemed panel of experts who will give us the facts about the current COVID-19 situation, answer some key questions, comment on the current medication shortage, and share what's being done by the Lupus Research Alliance and others on behalf of the lupus community. Our panel includes Kenneth Farber, President and CEO of the Lupus Research Alliance, a real champion in the lupus community. Dr. Daniel Wallace, who is one of the foremost lupus physicians in the world, based in Los Angeles. For those who don't know him, Dr. Wallace is Associate Director of the Rheumatology Fellowship Program, David Geffen School of Medicine Center at UCLA, in affiliation with Attune Health. He also serves on the board of directors for the LRA and is its clinical trial arm, Lupus Therapeutics. We also extremely are honored to have Dr. Peggy, who is the Chief of Rheumatology at the Hospital for Special Surgery and a renowned researcher here in New York. She is also a former co-chair of the LRA Scientific Advisory Board. Both New York and Los Angeles have been hit hard by the virus since they're so densely populated. However, as you know, the virus is spreading everywhere in the US and around the world. We heard you, your questions and top concerns, which we'll touch on today. Let's start with how the current COVID-19 crisis is affecting people living with lupus. Ken, first you. We hope you can provide a brief overview on the current situation and where we are today.
Sure, Brenda. First of all, thank you to you for moderating this, and thank you to Dr. Wallace and Dr. Crow. We could not ask for two more informed experts to educate all of us about what's going on. The situation as we face it right now is the following. There are indications, preliminary as they may be, there are indications that hydroxychloroquine, or Plaquenil as it's more commonly known, may be effective in the treatment of COVID-19 patients. Why it's effective is not entirely clear. It may help prevent the virus from replicating, from reproducing. It may be because Plaquenil has certain properties which allow it to, let's just say, mellow out the immune system. Whichever of those two reasons is the pertinent one, there are some people who think that Plaquenil could help COVID-19 patients. There are really three classes of patients who are using it. The first class is hospitalized COVID-19 patients who tend to be very ill. It's being used in that context at hospitals throughout the United States, primarily because the anecdotal evidence that it works and the good safety profile of the medicine is enough to convince infectious disease doctors that it's worth a try in these very ill patients. It's also being used, perhaps less frequently, in treating COVID-19 outpatients. These are people who are recovering at home and have a mild to moderate case. In some cases, their physicians are recommending that those patients take it. There's not a lot of evidence to suggest that that's a good idea. There's even less evidence than there may be for the hospitalized patients. And then the final group is people who are afraid they're going to get COVID-19. Patients who have not been diagnosed with a disorder, patients who may be completely asymptomatic and think they can take this medicine to prevent themselves from contracting the disorder, COVID-19. There's very little evidence, in fact, no evidence that it helps in that context, at least no evidence so far. What is the end result of all of this? The end result is the demand for the drug has gone way up. The supply of the drug has remained constant. And unfortunately, lupus patients who've been taking Plaquenil for years or even decades are having trouble accessing Plaquenil from their pharmacies. And that's what we're here to talk about today.
Dr. Wallace and Dr. Crow, any other perspectives to share? And what are the major concerns for people with lupus?
Which of us?
Dr. Wallace, you have your microphone on mute.
Dr. Crow, are you okay with that?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me try to address that. And my internet connection is
I'm
not.
unmuted. Okay.
Dan, you go first.
Dan, you go first.
Okay. Sorry about the technology here. We're all becoming techies in the last few weeks, far more than we ever expected. None of my lupus patients have developed COVID, which is quite remarkable. There has been, in my institution, probably 1,000 COVID patients have been admitted to the 7 hospitals that are affiliated with Cedars-Sinai. 1 has had lupus. So there's also a large transplant service at Cedars and their affiliated hospitals, and they have not reported a single case of COVID. It may be that the drugs that these patients are taking provides them with some type of protection. And also, I find this rather interesting, and I can't quite explain it. My patients are as scared and protective as anybody else. They use all the precautions that you're aware of, and we can get into specifics later. Most of my office is still open. I have some younger people who are physicians working and doing infusions because the American College of Rheumatology has recommended that patients on certain infusions continue to get them. We're also doing local injections or other shots that we need to do in emergency visits. But right now we have decreased our patient load by 90% and are doing telerheumatology.
Very much the same for me. I hope you can hear me. My connection is not great. As Dan said, just the anecdotal experience here in New York is that many more, presumably healthy people are developing infections with COVID-19 than we've seen in our lupus patients or rheumatoid arthritis patients. Of course, we need to collect data systematically, but I think lupus patients are being very careful, as we all are. But overall, I think doing pretty well under the circumstances. COVID-19 has taken over our hospital. As Dan said, almost no surgery and almost all telehealth visits for our patients.
Well, for both of you, what are you giving your patients in terms of advice? What are you giving for advice for your lupus patients and what they can do to protect themselves? For example, what practical tips do you give patients about physical distancing, and what should they do when they need to receive medical attention during this pandemic? First, you, Dr. Crow.
Oh, well, Dan, you go ahead first.
Fortunately, in Southern California, most people have homes or more space. So we do recommend that that people stay and quarantine themselves in their homes. When packages come to the house, we have them wash their hands after they open the packages. We have a lot of, when visitors come to the house, which is infrequent, or delivery people, or people come home from work who are family members, we have them change their clothes outside the house before they even walk in. They need to wash their hands, use all the precautions. I wanted to say something that may be inappropriate and it's anecdotal, but one of the heads of the COVID unit told me yesterday that you're talking about young people, that just about everybody under the age of 40 at our hospital, we have 118 with COVID in there right now. The group under 40, they all smoke, and most of them have vaped. And I don't know whether vaping damaged the lungs or not. I'm just throwing it out, and nothing may ever come from it.
Dr. Wallace and Dr. Crow, aside from the Plaquenil shortage, which we'll get to next? What are the most common?
So I hope you can hear me.
I'm sorry, Dr. Crow, please.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add, in addition to everything Dan said with regard to guidance to our patients, it is very, very important that you stay in close touch with your rheumatologist by phone, or if needed, set up a telehealth visit, which is being done widely now. So we want our patients to be very, very savvy and alert to the same symptoms we're all looking for: fevers, cough, and so on. Be in touch with your doctor if needed.
To both of you, aside from the Plaquenil shortage, in terms of what's next, what are the most common questions that you are hearing from your patients? Dr. Wallace, give us 2 or 3 of the most frequently asked questions, and how are you addressing them? And then after that, Dr. Crow, what are you hearing?
Lupus patients frequently have pleurisy or chest pains, and they're asking whether their chest symptoms could be early COVID. A lot of lupus patients run low-grade fevers, and we tell them not to worry unless the temperature is over 100. And the questions are mostly, can I see my grandchildren? Can I be with my children? What about my family members? I have somebody who comes to the house who does this or that or cleans once a week. Can they come in? And mostly related to just their environment.
Dr. Crow?
I think in general, our lupus patients and all of us are very interested in knowing, are there going to be treatments for this terrible infection? And you know, what is so interesting to me, and I'm sure Dan is aware of this too, is how much we've learned from studying lupus patients, COVID-19 disease. So many of, you know, what we call mechanisms, what goes wrong in the immune system of patients with lupus is really applicable to the COVID patients. So all of this information is helping us to think about what drugs to patients with COVID-19. And there are many, many interesting ideas out there.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Crow. Certainly on everyone's mind is a shortage of Plaquenil for people with lupus and others in this wave of the pandemic. let's talk about the widespread shortage and what does living with lupus, what people can do when they're faced with this situation personally. Ken, can you give us an overview of the shortage and as it now stands and what's going on to abate the problem? Is there anything people with lupus need to know about Plaquenil and are there alternatives?
Sure. Thank you, Brenda. Because of the technical glitch, a few people have been able to join us just recently, and to kind of catch them up on where we are, we have two of the most world-renowned lupologists here with us, Dr. Peggy Crow from the Hospital for Special Surgery and Dr. Dan Wallace from Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. Nobody knows more about lupus than these two experts. And of course, we have our wonderful moderator, Brenda Blackmon. So Brenda, you've asked me about what the status of the shortage is, what's being done to address it. Let me preface my answer to that question by saying that nobody hopes more than lupus patients that Plaquenil really does turn out to be an effective treatment for COVID-19. Now, we don't know for sure whether it does or not, whether it will be effective or not. There are early indications. There's reason to believe because of the way Plaquenil works in test tubes that it might work. There was even an early study that was reported on in the last couple of days out of China that was a little bit more rigorous than the previous studies that suggests that yes, indeed, Plaquenil might work. Why are lupus patients rooting for Plaquenil to be proven effective for COVID-19? The answer is simple. Lupus patients, like everybody else, have family, friends, neighbors, coworkers, and literally every person they meet on the street. We're all susceptible. And finding a treatment is critically important for everybody. If Plaquenil works, it's a godsend. That's the first thing. But the second thing is I was very intrigued by what Dan Wallace said earlier. You know, let's just say that perhaps Plaquenil will turn out to be an effective way of preventing COVID-19, or if it doesn't prevent the disorder, perhaps it'll turn out that patients who take Plaquenil have a lesser form of the disease. They get the disease less severely. Now, we don't know that that's true yet, but if that turns out to be true, finally, there's a silver lining to lupus. Finally, lupus patients who've taken Plaquenil for days, weeks, months, years, or decades may actually turn out to be less susceptible. So I want to clarify right out of the box that all of us hope that Plaquenil does turn out to be an effective therapy for COVID-19. The problem is we have to ensure a big enough supply. If it does turn out to be successful for the virus, we have to make sure that all the patients who need it for the viral infection get it, and we need to make sure that all the lupus patients who've been depending on it for a long time continue to be able to access it. There's some good news. The good news is the manufacturers of the drug are ramping up production as we speak. Sandoz, which is a division of a big drug company called Novartis, has just delivered a big supply of Plaquenil to the United States. Teva, which is another pharmaceutical company, has promised a large shipment will be available very, very soon. Bayer, which makes a related drug, not hydroxychloroquine, but chloroquine. That's not a drug lupus patients take, but it's a drug that may be efficacious for COVID-19 in the same way the hydroxychloroquine is. Bayer has just delivered a big supply, or is about to deliver a big supply of chloroquine to the United States. If COVID patients can take that drug, it frees up the supply of hydroxychloroquine. And so there are a number of manufacturers ramping up production. We have to watch, and we will scrutinize this with a fine-tooth comb. But we have to make sure that these shortages do abate in the short run. But as we do that, we want to assure lupus patients who may have heard that there are safety issues with Plaquenil, that that's not true. If they've been taking it under the care of their rheumatologist, they should continue to take it. That's the first thing. The second thing is we want lupus patients to do everything they can to follow the regimen that's prescribed to them by their physicians. That may be Plaquenil. It may be Plaquenil plus a number of other medicines which can also treat lupus. In some cities, Plaquenil is hard to get. It's impossible to get in a pharmacy in New York City right now. On the other hand, we've heard just recently that it is becoming more available in San Francisco, more available in San Diego. Dan has told me there's a shortage in Los Angeles, but that some patients are able to get it. We've checked in Florida. Patients on the East Coast of Florida are having a terrible time accessing it. People on the West Coast of Florida are having an easier time accessing it. So the shortage is worse in some places than others, but ultimately, Brenda, the trick is to dramatically ramp up supply so that everybody who needs it can get it. We're hopeful that that may happen before too long, but we will watch and we will do everything we can to make sure lupus patients can get the medicine they need.
Can I make a few comments?
Please.
First of all, I want to commend the LRA for its advocacy in working through its contacts with our pharmaceutical colleagues to help ensure supply, and also the other advocacy groups working to do this. I think also the Clinical Trials Network of the LRA is going to have a meeting very shortly, I think it's tomorrow, about how we can learn from some of the issues that Ken and Peggy have brought up. In my community, there are many small private pharmacies who we've worked with for a long time, and we have talked to these pharmacists, and they are putting aside hydroxychloroquine for patients, but we are required to email them verification that the patient really has lupus or has been on it before. And so that has made a huge difference. There's one pharmacy in Culver City that bought several thousand Plaquenils and is now holding it only for rheumatologists' patients. I think there have been some issues with misuse of Plaquenil, and these pharmacies are looking out for it. If a Cedars-Sinai related, which is again 7 hospitals and close to 3,000 beds, a Cedars-Sinai pharmacy is given a prescription for Plaquenil, they will call up the doctor and ask them for a history of the patient and why they need it. So it's like social distancing. If you're smart about it and you think it through, the shortage will be relatively short-lived. And I know you've talked about the cardiac complications. Let me address that, and then I'd like to hear Peggy's view. I have never gotten an EKG on a patient before giving a hydroxychloroquine prescription. The problems have mostly been in patients who were given chloroquine, which is almost never used for lupus except severe skin cases in the United States. And in the 1950s, when the drug came on the market, it was approved in doses of 600 to 800 milligrams a day for rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, which is 2 to 4 times the dose that's used. There were a few case reports in the literature at that time. I'm not aware of any issues that have occurred with hydroxychloroquine. What appeared in the press, I think, from somebody in Arizona was somebody taking chloroquine. So I think taking hydroxychloroquine in the usual lupus dose is not really a cardiotoxic drug. If one is on the agent for 5, 10, 15 years, then there are certain changes that can occur, but these are different.
Yeah, I would just add that we recognize that there has been a bit by anybody I know, but with the potential that it could be used in COVID-19 patients, There's clearly more use of Plaquenil. But we also want to reassure patients who've been on Plaquenil that, you know, if we go back to the published studies on the effectiveness of Plaquenil, it's clearly an excellent drug, but it's also true that patients who stop their Plaquenil for whatever reason don't necessarily flare right away. They may have some increased disease activity, but not for a number of months. So as Ken said, we're certainly optimistic that the manufacturers will be restoring the supply, and patients, I think, should not be concerned that their lupus activity will be significantly impacted by all of this disruption going on.
So Brenda, one thing that I would add, just to amplify what Peggy and Dan said, this has actually been studied very carefully in the 1990s. There was a group in the 1990s, 5 centers in Canada, that studied what happens to patients who've been taking Plaquenil for a period of time and then stop taking it. And we can let our audience know exactly where they can look and see that publication for themselves if they're so inclined. And what it discovered, what it determined, is that indeed lupus patients who rely on Plaquenil for their treatment are more likely to flare if they go off Plaquenil for an extended period of time. But what that publication also showed is that it takes several weeks, really up to 2 months, before the risk of flare becomes a severe risk. So why do I mention that? I only mention it because we don't want patients not to be able to get their Plaquenil, but nor do we want patients who can't get their Plaquenil for a few days or even a week or two to panic that something terrible will happen to them. That's the first thing. What should a patient do if they can't get Plaquenil? The first thing they should do is call their rheumatologist. Their rheumatologist can give them some good advice. That advice might be to let's relax for a while, not worry about it, and see if you can get the Plaquenil prescription filled next week or the week after. I don't think anything bad is going to happen. Or perhaps the rheumatologist will say to that patient, you know, we wish you had Plaquenil, but let's think about what alternatives might be in the short run. And the good news is, and I know Peggy and Dan will agree with this, that if necessary, there are alternatives that patients can get in the short run that can help treat their lupus. And then once Plaquenil becomes available, patients can access it again.
And let's talk about some of those alternatives as well as what you can do to help patients deal with that stress. Starting with you, Dr. Wallace.
If one is running low on Plaquenil and they're on 2 tablets a day, we can tell them to take 1 tablet a day. We can tell them to take it every other day. Ken is absolutely right. The drug has, for lupus, it doesn't result in a flare for several months afterwards. We have other lupus anti-inflammatories that we can use, and we don't necessarily want to immune suppress our patients further, but for those with non-organ threatening disease, in other words, the heart, lung, kidney, liver, brain, and bone marrow are not involved, we can often treat them symptomatically. For rashes, there's lots of other agents and topicals we can use. For arthritis, there's other agents that we can use. And I invite you to ask your treating rheumatologist or lupus doctor, which might not be a rheumatologist, could be an internist or like a hematologist or a nephrologist or a dermatologist or somebody who's knowledgeable in the area of lupus. And this is not a life sentence or a critical sentence of flares. The study from the Canadian Cooperative Trials that Ken quoted looked at flare rates over a 6-month period where half the patients had the drug stopped when they were in remission and half continued it.
Dr. Crow.
also asked about stress. And clearly, not only lupus patients, but all of us have gone through in our lifetimes. And, you know, I think an important guidance is to stay connected. I mean, FaceTime your grandchildren, call your friends, and get plenty of sleep. I've had to tell myself it's time to go to bed. So no doubt that this is a very stressful period, but I think we all have to put a lot of intention on what we do every day with an effort to modify that stress as much as we can.
The head bone is connected to the immune bone.
And Dr. Wallace, because of the having to isolate so much, for lupus patients, that's maybe extremely difficult when they need someone to perhaps help them around, and so many specific instances or unusual instances. What do they do?
Well, most of our lupus patients live with somebody, and that is their support system. And if the person is been sort of home quarantined for 14 days, then there's a lot more flexibility as to how they can interact and how that individual safely could make sure that everything is done. We have our patients in Southern California walk around the block with masks and all the protective areas, as long as there's nobody else around. Areas that have higher density need to have, I'm sure, adopted other strategies. But again, the family support system is very important. My partner, who is a rheumatologist, or the person who shares space with me who's a rheumatologist, his wife is a physician for the Los Angeles County Public Health Department. And she's told me some terrible stories of the fact that in the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of people found home dead by themselves, and they were living by themselves, and they never saw a doctor. And this hasn't really come out very much yet. But I want to encourage anybody who knows somebody, especially those with lupus, who lives by themselves, to call them and check on them and make sure somebody is looking after them.
I completely agree. Just stay in touch.
And Ken, can you also give some advice? Because of course you've been in the New York area. Do you think there's a difference in the East Coast versus the West Coast and how they're dealing with this?
Well, clearly, there are some communities, some municipalities that are dramatically more affected than others. There's nowhere in the United States and few places in the world which are experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic as vigorously as we are in New York City and New York State. And for that reason, the requirements to lock down in New York State are greater. The difficulties in terms of going out are greater. And the Plaquenil shortage is greater. All that stands to reason. But I do think one of the things that the rest of the country has to keep in mind is what New York is experiencing now could very well be what other geographic areas are experiencing 3 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now, or 6 weeks from now. I do think that a lot of the lessons that we're learning in New York are exportable to the rest of the country, and maybe if those lessons are followed, the incidence of the virus will at least abate a little. That would be the hope. But you know, Brenda, as we all think about how stressed and depressed we are about what is clearly a situation that is unprecedented, I don't think there is anybody alive anywhere today who's ever experienced anything like we're experiencing now. And when this is all over, while we're obviously going to grieve for those we've lost and those who experienced a really terrible situation being ill, I do think that there are things that we're going to be thankful for. And, these are not talked about enough. I'll tell you what's been remarkable to me. It is remarkable to me how the biomedical research community, how physicians, how the pharmaceutical industry has really rallied to try to find a solution. It has literally been all hands on deck. And we could be very proud of that. We have pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies all over the United States who've literally dropped what they were doing so they could apply their expertise to finding a solution to COVID-19. We have academic investigators, and Peggy Crow and Dan Wallace know them all, who've spent their lives thinking about immunology and rheumatology and how to treat patients, who literally are bringing every ounce of their expertise to the fight against COVID. Peggy Crow on this call is the perfect example of that. Physicians in LA and New York and everywhere else, dropping what they're doing to help treat a disease that nobody knows very much about. This is a remarkable thing. And it's something I think all Americans can be proud of. I think all Americans can be inspired by. And when this is over, as it surely will be, I think there are going to be some things to look back on with pride. And for lupus patients, if it turns out that Plaquenil is indeed effective at preventing the disorder or making sure that people who get the disorder get a milder case, how great would it be that finally, at long last, something good came out of having lupus? If Plaquenil helps lupus patients not get the disease or have a milder course, that's something to celebrate too, don't you think?
I'll just echo everything Ken just said. And for some of those who weren't on the call earlier, I was saying how remarkable it is that what we're learning about COVID-19 disease is so reminiscent of some aspects of lupus. Lupus has sort of a slow, smoldering, inflammatory situation. COVID is so acute and dramatic. But all of this research, with everyone coming together to focus on COVID-19, I will bet is going to teach us more about lupus as well. So, it's really ironic that those of us, for example, who've studied interferon in lupus for the last 20 years are recognizing the role of interferon in COVID-19, and it goes on and on. So a lot is being learned that will be applicable to lupus as well in the long run.
My medical center has put together COVID committees, as I'm sure all the hospitals have, and the collaborations of people with skill sets that interconnect or cross-pollinate, who never really worked with each other. This is going to lead to collaborations that will be useful for years to come.
So Brenda, if I could ask, if you'll permit me to ask Dan one question. Another piece of this that has been absolutely fascinating is that while there are many, many medications approved for other diseases that are being thought about for COVID-19, it seems that several medicines used by rheumatologists are at the top of the list. And, I think that's kind of interesting. And I wonder if Peggy and Dan, who both have so much expertise in this area, might comment on why rheumatology medications, not necessarily lupus medications, but rheumatology medicines seem to be so intriguing as potential study candidates for the virus.
Well, what's going on in pulmonary involvement of COVID is something called fibrosis or scarring of the lungs, but it's also associated with something called a cytokine storm, which is the release of certain pro-inflammatory factors, cytokines, interferons, where Peggy is the world authority. And Some of the agents that are used to treat this, such as inhibitors of interleukin-6, tocilizumab, or sarilumab, or blocking interleukin-1, which is anakinra or Kineret. And some of these agents may ameliorate cytokine storm and complement activation and other chemicals that are associated with activity that is found in COVID. We have, what rheumatologists have that they could offer is a great deal of experience and expertise of the nuances of these drugs, how to handle dosing and possible toxicities and monitoring the patients.
Yeah, and many of those treatments that are very familiar to us, whether it's in lupus or rheumatoid arthritis or other rheumatic diseases, we're literally making lists and talking with our colleagues about, well, what would be the advantage of this one? Would there be safety issues? So, I think the answer to Ken's question, COVID-19, are based in the immune system and in dysfunction of the immune system, and with very, very related ways of the immune system going awry. Differences, but a lot of common themes.
So Peggy and Dan, there are a couple of questions that we're getting frequently, and one of them is a question that we've gotten from several pregnant lupus patients who wonder if it's more problematic for pregnant women who have lupus to stop their Plaquenil than it might be for other patients.
Plaquenil is safe in pregnancy, and that's been documented by many, many studies over the years. It's safe with breastfeeding. And there was a study in the UK where they clearly documented this and showed that actually not taking it was associated with more pregnancy complications.
So it's especially critical for pregnant patients with lupus that they do get their Plaquenil. Is that right or wrong, Dan?
Right.
Okay.
Ken, you're so hopeful in terms of once the COVID-19 is over, and it will be over, just as Dr. Wallace and Dr. Crow have mentioned. How is what we've learned from this going to really, you think, be helpful for LRA and other organizations?
Well, so that's a really interesting question. And I do want to call out two other lupus organizations that have really joined us at the forefront in the fight to ensure that Plaquenil is available. One is the Lupus and Allied Diseases Association, and the other is Lupus LA. Those organizations, very much like the Lupus Research Alliance, exist for exactly one purpose, and that purpose is to help lupus patients and ultimately find a way to prevent, treat, and cure the disease. All of us share that aspiration. To answer your question more directly, Brenda, I think Peggy said it all. I mean, to the extent that COVID-19, pneumonia, and acute respiratory distress are caused by an overexuberant immune system, finding treatments for that is going to make us a lot smarter. It's going to make immunologists a lot smarter. It's going to make physicians a lot smarter. It's going to make rheumatologists a lot smarter. And this cytokine storm, Dan Wallace alluded to it a few minutes ago, this problem is seen in a multiplicity of diseases. It's not just cytokine, it's not just COVID-19 pneumonia where patients experience cytokine storm. There are literally many, many conditions that are often fatal where cytokine storm is a problem. If we can use COVID-19 as the vector, as the mechanism to inspire us to develop better treatments for cytokine storm, we will have helped patients who have cancer, we'll have helped patients who have other types of serious pneumonias. We might have helped patients who have graft versus host disease. There's a whole variety of other conditions that might benefit from the research that comes out of this. But we're here to talk about lupus. And if there's one message or two messages that I hope lupus patients will walk away from this seminar with, the first message is that we will not stop, we will not pause, we will not tire until this Plaquenil shortage is alleviated. We think we're on the road to doing that. We're not positive, but we think we're on the road to doing that, and we are on it. We won't stop until the supply problem goes away. That's the first thing. The second thing is that while not being able to get Plaquenil, if patients can't get it, is not good. It's not good at all. There are alternatives. You talk to your rheumatologist can discuss those alternatives with you. You know, no matter how bad the situation is, panic never accomplishes anything. And I think the good news is that despite the real problem of Plaquenil being in short supply, nobody should encourage patients to panic, A, because it's not productive, and B, because it's not necessary.
You know, we've only got about 10 more minutes, but I do want to ask both Dr. Crow and Dr. Wallace how important it is, even during this COVID-19 crisis, that the patients speak with and talk with the physicians.
Absolutely. I know Dan will agree. You know, we've been writing at Hospital for Special Surgery blog how to, you know, how they're doing, their symptoms, and should anything out of the ordinary develop, to get in touch with their doctors. Absolutely.
Yes, we've sent email blasts to all of our lupus patients about how to contact us in all our procedures, availability of telemedicine, and you know, our fellows are working, are being inducted into helping us with all this as well.
And are you as doctors learning more about how to deal with your patients during this crisis as well? Are you learning more about research and about things that you didn't think you'd be getting involved with?
I'm learning a lot about COVID-19. I'm learning, and you know, everyone probably remembers the SARS epidemic, which really did not impact the United States too much, but that was caused by a very, very similar virus. And what many of us are doing is going back and reading the scientific literature from the years of the SARS epidemic, and very, very similar ideas about what's going wrong are probably, you know, true in COVID-19 as well. So we're learning a tremendous amount just in the probably 3 weeks we've been working on this about this disease. You know, in terms of caring for the patients, we've mentioned telehealth a few times. At HSS, Hospital for Special Surgery, we were planning to roll out telehealth visits about a year from now. Well, we ramped it up in 1 week, and I give a lot of credit for our IT people and our doctors and our administrators who worked like crazy to make that happen. And it's a whole new way of taking care of patients, and I think it works pretty well.
Unfortunately, we can't hug the patients and might not be able to do it for a while. The second point is that telehealth is very, very important, and I think Peggy and I are both on the same electronic medical record system, EPIC, which makes it very user-friendly to implement telehealth, and we've been able to do that. Also, I do want to mention that I think within the next year, and tell me if you agree, Peggy, there will be a vaccine.
Research is moving like lightning. And, you know, vaccines just take a while. You know, you need to understand the virus and then try different approaches to generating an immune response to the virus. And, you know, I'll point out that just because an individual makes antibodies to a virus or some of its proteins or some of its molecules doesn't mean those antibodies are going to protect. So in addition to testing different approaches to vaccines, how good they are really has to be studied, and it takes a while. But I think lots of activity already, and I think, a year and a half sounds about right.
Well, Ken Farber, repurposing is a subject that LRA has certainly taken up. So let's talk about how that process has been speeded up.
Well, it's actually kind of remarkable. What drug repurposing is, for those who don't know, Brenda, is it's taking medicines that have been approved for one disease and seeing if they might help with another disease. And, in the world of lupus, for about the last two or 3 years, we have been very active in this area. We are looking at the Lupus Research Alliance, we're looking at medicines for rheumatoid arthritis, we're looking at medicines for psoriasis, we're even looking at medicines that are used to treat cancer, to see if some of those medicines, perhaps at a lower dose, but to see if some of those medicines might actually help lupus patients. And we have some preliminary indications. It's not money in the bank yet, Brenda, but we have some preliminary indications that there may be some of these repurposed medicines that in the next couple of years might be approved for lupus. So that's good news. That's exciting news. Now, all of a sudden, we have this brand new disorder, this brand new disease that has come upon us almost from out of the blue. And we're having to take the same approach, looking at medicines for other diseases to see if they might help for COVID-19. I think the lupus community can be very proud of the fact, and at least, kind of take some satisfaction that one of the first drugs being considered for repurposing is a drug that all of us have depended on for decades. The fact that Plaquenil, a drug that every rheumatologist knows a lot about and most lupus patients know a lot about, a drug that's safe, relatively, a drug that's effective, relatively, the fact that a drug that we're so familiar with might help patients and prevent them from getting desperately ill with COVID, that's a great thing, as long as the supply of the drug is enough for everybody. We will make sure that it is.
That was definitely something we could leave on, but instead I want you to give some final words to the lupus community before we conclude the webcast in the last couple of minutes.
Terrific. So, we have two of the most prominent rheumatologists in America on this call right now. But both of them will agree that their colleagues, and there are literally hundreds of them, are as devoted to helping their rheumatology patients in general and their lupus patients as these two fine physicians are. So our community is blessed with the fact that there are so many rheumatologists who are not only so smart, but also so caring and committed. That makes us lucky as a community. That's the first thing. The second thing I think people should keep in mind is that we're also blessed by having some of the smartest biomedical research scientists who think about lupus, who are now beginning to think about how they can bring their skills and talent to this new disorder that all of us are worried about. It's another way that we're blessed. I think we're also blessed by having a number of voluntary health agencies that are here for exactly one purpose, and that's to help lupus patients. Brenda, I hope it does not sound immodest, but I will say that the staff and volunteer leadership of the Lupus Research Alliance, our trustees, all of us are fully engaged in this fight. Our organization is here for exactly one purpose, and that purpose is to help lupus patients. We want to help lupus patients deal with this new COVID crisis. We want to help lupus patients get the medicines that they need and alleviate the Plaquenil shortage. And ultimately, we will work our hearts out to find better treatments and someday a cure. That's what the Lupus Research Alliance is all about. And we will keep our eye on goal. We won't stop. We will focus like a laser beam on ensuring that we get to where we need to be.
Well, we are certainly blessed to have you as president of the Lupus Research Alliance. And thank you, Dr. Crow and Dr. Wallace, and of course, Ken. You have given us so much valuable information and reassurance about the situation. I know that I feel better, and I hope others feel the same, just about hearing all that's being done to make sure people with lupus are being treated and will have as little interruption as possible during this challenging time. Be safe, be well, and we will all get through this together.
Thanks so much, Brenda.
Thank you.